Okay. All right. Why can't I? There we go. Okay. So what's in the science section? So on the TEAS, the three big ones you cover in the science section are biology, anatomy, physiology, and chemistry. So what are we going to cover today? Today we're just going to go over atoms and macromolecules, cells and organelles, genetics and Punnett squares, and some of the major organs and systems in the body. This section, while I try to go as in-depth as I could, it does not cover all the material in the science section. There's a lot of it. I really just addressed, I think, the ones that students tend to seem to have the most questions about. But yeah, so we're also going to not really go into so much depth that you'll be prepared for the TEAS. It's more of just giving you a really good idea of what it is you need to study on. All right. So first things first, I'd like to give advice on how to study for the science section. So some big things to do, I think, in order to learn pretty much any material, but specifically anatomy, is repetition. You really have to just practice with the material. It's not really something you can just read once out of a book and then you just suddenly know it. You really have to work with the material. And some of the ways I usually recommend doing that are like flashcards, so brain fuse. I really recommend when you learn anatomy to fill in blank anatomy tables. So like, for example, something that looks like this. It's just the numbers on the organ, and then you just memorize them, be able to fill them out. And usually what I do with that is when you learn the structure of an organ by doing these label sheets, you tend to be able to also just tie in the function. So for instance, 12 here is the cerebellum. You just know that by its location, but then you also be like, oh, what does the cerebellum do? Oh, well, it's responsible for balance and coordination, stuff like that. Definitely too is practice tests. So we have plenty of resources on our LibGuides for practice tests and TEAS books that you can rent out. Definitely just want to develop a confidence with the material. So another thing too is it's something called elaborative rehearsal. That's just a fancy way of saying don't just try to gouge down as much information as you can. The best way you remember stuff is when you have some type of connection to other material or some type of personal connection. A really funny one that I like to mention is a lot of nurses, they remember a lot of stuff for the medical books by watching like Grey's Anatomy or House or some other medical show like that. But it's just some type of connection where you can think, oh, I've seen this before. Where have I seen this before? And then by doing that, you more easily recall it. Okay. And then lastly, major, not minor. The advice there is that you really want to understand the broad topics. You don't have to be an expert on like the nervous system, but you definitely need to know just like the major organs of the nervous system. So don't try to be so minute with the amount of details you need to memorize. Okay. Some questions while you're studying the human body. I think you should always ask yourself are what are the major parts of the system? What's the major function of that system? And what's the major diseases of that organ system? If you ask those three questions, you really tend to like really understand, have a good grasp on every single part of the human body. John, is there anything you want to
add? With major diseases, just know like 2 or 3 for each organ, and that should kind of cover what you need to know. You do not need to know kind of how we would treat a condition with relation to patient care. You'll learn that in nursing school.
All right, cool. All right, so now we're actually going to get into the actual material that you guys are going to see on the test. First things first, just some basic science know-how. So in science, whenever you want to test an hypothesis, you have to set up an experiment. And the way you do that is you always have 3 things you set up in your experiment. First things first is the independent variable. And so the independent variable is the variable that you manipulate. So for instance, if you're measuring, let's say, the effect of the pH of water on the height of a plant, right? The independent variable would be the pH of the water, because you can manipulate that, make it more acidic or basic. And the dependent variable would be the one that you measure, or the height of the plant. The control variable would then be the thing that you compare it to. So let's say, for instance, you just use plain old water. It's kind of like you have an expected result. And so you compare it to that to see the changes that your independent variable has on your dependent variable. Okay. And then lastly, you guys want to get very, very, very familiar with the metric system. That's just how you convert between different units. One good acronym that I always enjoyed was King Henry died while drinking chocolate milk. That's a lot of milk. I also added with 3 monks and 3 nuns because the monks and the nuns, that has to do micro and nano. You guys mostly work in milli and micro doses, I believe. So just really want to understand that you guys need to be able to convert between these different units. The really simple way to do it is you just either multiply or divide by 10, or if you want, you can think of it as moving the decimal over 1 or moving the decimal back 1. Okay. Chat. Yep. So John says re-emphasizing conversion is super important. You'll see that on both the math and science section. Okay. So to kind of organize the structure of this PowerPoint, you kind of want to think of the levels of organization to living organisms. So at the very basic, you have atoms, and then those atoms combine to form molecules, and those molecules combine to form cells. Cells combine to form tissues. Tissues of a similar function combine to form organs. Organs combine together to form a system, and systems combine to make an organism. So starting at the very basic level, we're going to start with atoms. So atoms are the smallest unit of matter. They are atoms of a single type are called elements. So like for instance, carbon, hydrogen bond together are called compounds, like CO2. So the parts of an atom are the nucleus, and the protons inside are the positively charged particles. Neutrons are the neutral parts, and then around orbiting that in the cloud are the electrons, and they're negative charged. So this is like the periodic table you've seen like 1,000 times before. But how you actually go about reading the periodic table is that the atomic number here, so carbon has a atomic number of 6, is the number of protons in that atom. So the number of protons actually identifies what type of atom it is. So for instance, hydrogen has 1 proton, helium 2, and so on and so forth. And then atomic mass is actually the mass of the nucleus. So it's the number of protons and the number of neutrons. Now isotopes though are the same type of atom, however, they have different number of neutrons. So you can have, say, atomic mass of 13 or 11 or something like that. Okay, so once these atoms combine, they form what's called molecules. And the human body, there are 4 big major macromolecules. So the essential molecules for the human body, a single unit is called a monomer, while a chain of those units is called a polymer. So these chains are formed with a process called dehydration synthesis, which is essentially by taking out of water, 2 things combine. And they break down with something called hydrolysis. So by adding the water, they separate. So going into the 4 main types, there's carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are your sugars. They're used for short-term energy. Their monomer is something called a monosaccharide, and the most common big long chains are called polysaccharides. And there's like starch, stuff you find in potatoes. So next we have lipids. So lipids are fats. They're used for long-term energy and forming cell membranes. So their monomers are these fatty acid tails. And their polymers, when they combine, can form a different multiple things. Some of the most common are triglycerides, steroids, and phospholipids. Okay. Next, we have proteins. So proteins are used for multiple functions in your body. There's pretty much for every function in the human body, there's a protein for it. Their individual units are called amino acids, which is shown here. So an amino acid has an amino group, which is this. Our carboxyl group looks like this, and our side chain. So this little side chain, whatever bonds to it determines what type of amino acid it is. And now what happens is these amino acids combine and form polypeptides. Okay. And then lastly, you have nucleic acids. So nucleic acids are used for genetic information. Their monomer is a nucleotide, which looks like this. It has a phosphate group, a nitrogenous base, and a sugar. And when they form long chains, they form polynucleotides. And the most common you've heard of that is DNA and RNA. Okay, so moving up a level, we're going to start looking at cells. So for cells, the cells are the unit of life. And the things you want to really understand are the cell theory, which is that all living organisms are composed of cells, and cells only come from other cells. Now, on the T's, you definitely want to learn the organelles that are found inside all animal cells and their functions. So for example, you want to know the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. The nucleus is the genetic storage of the cell. And ribosomes, if you want to go through and make sure you learn all these organelles and all different functions. Okay. So now we're going to segue to genetics. So on the TEAS test, they will ask you some basic Mendelian genetics. So to understand some basics of that, DNA is the molecule that holds the genetic information for an organism. It's stored on the organism's chromosomes found inside its nucleus, and it looks like a double helix. So inside the double helix, you have these base pairs, and those base pairs are those different nitrogenous bases I mentioned earlier. So we have adenine that pairs with thymine, guanine that pairs with cytosine. Okay, so a big thing in biology to understand is that DNA gets transcribed into something called RNA, and then RNA gets translated into your proteins. So a big thing about DNA is you can think of it as it's the code for the types of proteins that the human body produces. And DNA keeps itself going by something called replication. But essentially just know that DNA encodes for your proteins. So what are genes? So a gene is a section on a chromosome that corresponds to a specific protein it encodes for. So a gene can have different types though, called alleles. So for example, the gene for, say, height can have either a tall allele or a short allele. So inside the organism, you have the genotype and the phenotype. So the genotype is actually the genetic makeup of the organism, while the phenotype is actually the physical characteristics of an organism. So for instance, you could have a genotype of, say, blonde hair, and your phenotype would be actual physical expression of the blonde hair. Okay, so everyone has two alleles for a gene, one from your mom and one from your dad. So if someone receives two different allele types, so let's say, for instance, you get one allele for tall from your dad and one allele short from your mom, one will always be physically expressed if they are a carrier for it. This allele is called dominant. So assuming that you get the tall allele as dominant over the short allele, if you get the tall allele, that means that you will physically be tall, even though you could be a carrier for the short allele. So this means that that allele is dominant over the other allele, which is recessive. Okay. So to kind of understand the possible outcomes of these the possible genotypes and phenotypes of offsprings, you use what's called Punnett squares. So Punnett squares basically take the alleles from your mom and cross them with the alleles from your dad, and then they give you the possible outcomes that you might get as an offspring. So the three outcomes you are either homogeneous dominant, homozygous dominant, and what that is, it means both your alleles are the dominant tall gene. Heterozygous means that you carry both the tall allele and the short allele, or you carry both the dominant allele and the recessive allele. But in this case, though, since you have that dominant allele, that means you will physically be tall. And then homozygous recessive is when you carry both of the recessive alleles. Okay? And we're going to do a practice problem later on to explain these. Okay? So moving on, now we have tissues. So tissues are cells of a similar function performing a similar function all in unison. And the four major types that you know are going to be connective, epithelial, muscle, and nervous tissue. Okay? Because now when tissues combine, they form organs, and then those organs combine with different organs to form organ systems. So this is actually going to cover some of the major organ systems that are in the human body. So first things first, you want to understand anatomical planes. So anatomical planes divide the human body into different sections. So the coronal plane divides the human body into front and back. The sagittal plane divides the body into left and right. And then the transverse plane divides it into top and bottom. And so the ways you would describe where organs are relative to each other is you would use, say, like anteriors to the front, posteriors to the back, medial is more to the middle, lateral is more to the periphery, superior is more to the top, inferior is more to the lower. So this is really just helping you understand where different organs are relative to each other. Okay, so actually getting into nitty gritty. So the first system we're going to cover is the respiratory system. So the respiratory system provides oxygen to the cells and also removes carbon dioxide. So the reason why your cells need oxygen is because inside those mitochondria inside your cells, they actually use oxygen to perform what's called respiration. which pretty much produces all the energy the human body needs for its daily activities. So the process of respiratory system as air moves through it is that air travels through the nasal cavity, down the trachea, and into the lungs bronchi. And at the end of each bronchiole, you'll have an alveoli, which is kind of like a grape flow structure. And that's where oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged with the blood. So the way your lungs actually inflate and deflate is not by raising your chest as like some people breathe, but it's actually done by your diaphragm, which when it expands, it increases the amount of area that your lungs can reach so more air can come in. And then when they flatten, they expel your lungs. Okay, moving on. So this is the cardiovascular system. So the cardiovascular system is the body's transport system. So it's essentially how the body transports nutrients from around the body and also transports waste. So the difference is arteries carry blood away from the heart, while veins carry blood to the heart. And inside the circulatory system, you have two main loops. You have the pulmonary, which is essentially the movement of blood into the lungs and out to the body, and then systemic, which is the movement of the blood from the body back into the heart. So speaking of the heart, you definitely want to know the anatomy of the heart. So the heart has four main chambers. You have the left and right ventricle, which actually does the pumping. So the right ventricle pumps into the lungs. The left ventricle pumps into the body. And then you have the atrium. So you can kind of think of them as the storage. While the ventricle is emptying, you have blood pooling up here for the next pump. So how the heart actually pumps itself is with a chemical pacemaker called the sinoatrial node. So if anybody you know has a pacemaker, it's essentially just a little electrical device that causes your heart to contract, but your body has a natural one. Okay? So now we're going to go into the gastrointestinal system. So the goal of the gastrointestinal system is to break food down physically and chemically. So the process is that when you eat food, it's chewed and broken down by saliva into something called a bolus. That bolus is then swallowed down the esophagus into your stomach. And here you have the gastric juice, which composes mostly of hydrochloric acid that breaks down that food into like this liquid slush called chyme. This chyme, then goes down into the intestines. So the chyme is sent through the small intestine where most of the nutrient absorption actually happens. And then all the unabsorbed food is passed to the large intestine, which is the colon. And then here in the large intestine or the colon, that's where feces are formed. And then that feces accumulates in the rectum to be eliminated later. Okay. So now we have enzymes. So to go back to what we were talking about with proteins, enzymes are proteins. And what they do is that they lower the activation energy for a chemical reaction to occur. So the activation energy is actually the amount of energy needed for a chemical reaction to actually occur. These are actually really important because if you look at the amount of energy required to digest food, if we didn't have enzymes, it would be so much that it wouldn't really be a point of eating food. There would be no net gain. But because of enzymes, we can actually eat food and actually get a lot of energy back from it. So a key way to identify enzymes is with the suffix ase. However, this isn't always true. Sometimes you have specific ones like pepsin or trypsin, which are the enzymes inside the stomach that help break down protein. So definitely, as John told me, you want to make sure that you keep an eye out and really study the stuff related to biochemistry, as they love to ask you questions related to them. Okay, moving on. We now have the nervous system. So the nervous system is the communication center of the body. It has two main parts, the central nervous system, which is composed of the brain and spine, and the peripheral nervous system, which is all your sensory nerves throughout your body. So in your central nervous system, you have your brain, and your brain is pretty much the control center of your entire body. But for different parts of the brain, you have different functions. So for instance, the frontal lobe handles executive functions like thinking, solving, problem solving, language, stuff like that. Temporal lobe handles a lot of your memory. Motor cortex handles movement. Sensory cortex handles sensation. Occipital lobe covers your vision and some other stuff like that. So the nervous system is actually composed of what's called neurons, which is the chief cell of it. So the neuron is composed of your dendrite, which is kind of like the endpoint, these dendrites, which help connect it to other neurons, the axon, and then here you have what's the synapses. So how neurons actually communicate and how your brain actually sends signals is done with what's called neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are actually the chemical electrical signals that your neurons use to communicate with each other. And they release those neurotransmitters at what's called the synapse, which is those little areas right here. So different neurotransmitters handle different functions and different things in the human brain. So for instance, you have the neurotransmitter called like dopamine or serotonin, which you probably heard is related to happiness. Okay, moving on, we now have the muscular system. So the muscular system is used for body movement. The three main types you find in the body are skeletal, which is used to move your bones, cardiac, which is used for your heart, and smooth. And smooth muscle is found within the stomach. So in the colon. And the colon, it actually does something called peristalsis, which is actually the movement of food throughout the intestines. So next you have tendons. So tendons are actually muscle that connects to bone. And then you have ligaments, which connects bone to bone, which is used more for structure. Okay, moving on. We now have the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is the hormone system of the human body. It also does a form of communication. I like to say that it moves at a much slower and longer rate than the nervous system. In the endocrine system, when your hormones are unbalanced, you end up with certain diseases. Like for instance, diabetes is a result of when the hormone insulin isn't in proper amounts. You guys definitely want to know the different types of glands and what specific hormones come from those different types of glands. Okay, now we're going to the, can't really say that, but yeah, urinary system. So the purpose of the urinary system is to eliminate body waste and filter blood. So the urinary system is composed of your kidneys, which are divided into the cortex and medulla. And the filtering process is actually done through tubes called nephrons. And inside those tubes, you have something called the glomerulus, which actually does the filtering. Think of it like the Brita filters for the blood. So the kidneys actually filter out the waste and toxins, but they keep proteins and ions inside the blood, and they flush that back to the body. After the waste is removed, this fluid is called urine, and this urine is passed through the ureters into the bladder. And here it's stored until time for pee when it's done out the urethra. Okay. Next, we're finally going to talk about the immune system. So the immune system is your defense against foreign invaders. It's broken down into 3 lines of defenses. So the first line is pretty much a barrier. It's anything that pretty much prevents infection from even occurring. For instance, you have your skin, you have your earwax, you have mucus in your nose, stuff like that. It just prevents bad things from getting inside. Then you have non-specific. So non-specific is just an immune reaction to anything harmful or foreign in the body. It doesn't really know what it is. It's just attacking it because it's unknown. You'll usually see a non-specific attack in the form of inflammation. So inflammation is usually the signs is red, hot, swollen, and tender. And what they're trying to do is basically remove the infection and stop any other bodily harm that's occurred in the wound. Usually the white blood cells responsible for this are called phagocytes and natural killer cells. Then lastly, you have the line defense called specific immunity. So specific immunity has to do with the antibodies. And what it does, it helps recognize unique pathogens. So B cells bind to specific antigens and then they produce antibodies. This is called the humoral response. And then memory cells help remember the past invaders. So what happens when you have a repeated infection is that memory cells will remind the B cells what that infection is, and they'll produce antibodies, which helps prevent an infection, a worse infection from happening in the first time. And inside these two, you also have your helper T cells and your killer T cells. What they do is essentially just seek out that known invader and kill it. Okay, so I went through that pretty fast. I know I had a lot of material. That's why I was trying to make sure we had plenty of time for questions. Is there anything you guys want me to go over specifically? And if not, we can do the practice questions. If you have any questions about the TEAS itself, I know John can answer that too. Oh,
It doesn't look like anyone has any questions.
okay. I guess I can go for the practice questions. And if you guys want to participate, you can put the answers in the chat. If not, then it's just questions related to the material we covered, and I'll still go over it. So here they go. that starts in the beginning. Okay. So what symptoms would you expect in a patient with low blood oxygen? Would it be joint pain, excessive bleeding, weakness and low energy, or nausea? Oh, whoops. All right, cool. Participating. Okay, cool. So yeah, it would be B. And again, it just goes back to the idea that the purpose of breathing oxygen is to give O2 for respiration, which is the way you get energy for your cells. So if you're not breathing a lot, that means you're not getting a lot of respiration, which means you're not getting a lot of energy. Cool, cool, cool. Moving on. So where is food broken down by digestive system ultimately enter the bloodstream? Oh, sorry, I read that wrong. Where is the food broken down by digestive system so it can ultimately enter the bloodstream? Yep, it would be D. So just remember that the mouth, stomach, and small intestine is actually where food is broken down the most and most nutrients absorbed. The main purpose of the large intestine is to pick up any straggling nutrients, but also really the purpose is to make feces to then end up in the rectum. Okay. So the systemic loop carries oxygenated blood to the body from which chamber of the heart? Yep, that's right. Left ventricle. So again, the left and right ventricle, the right ventricle pumps deoxygenated blood to the lungs, while the left ventricle pumps oxygenated blood back into the body. And then the atriums are kind of just the ones that hold blood while the ventricles are pumping. Okay. So a hospital manager suspects that the pay scale for nurses and the number of complaints that the hospital receives from patients are inversely proportional. The manager is organizing a study to prove our hypothesis. Which of the following points? The pay scale for nurses, the number of nurses, the number of patients. Okay, so this guy, you want to keep an eye out on some keywords. So the term inversely proportional means that as one increases, you would expect the other one to decrease. So in this case, the hospital manager is suspecting that as pay scale increases, you're expecting the number of complaints to go. So if you look at the dependent variable, that's the thing you want to see is getting measured, right? So the answer would be A. A, the dependent variable. The reason being is that the thing you're measuring is the number of complaints, but the thing that you can manipulate, quote unquote, is the pay scale. So as you increase the pay, you would then measure the number of complaints, or as you decrease the pay, you would then measure the number of complaints. So remember, independent variable is the one you can manipulate. The one you measure is the number of complaints. Okay, so this one I'm going to walk you guys through how to do a Punnett square. I need my stylus. Where's my stylus? Okay, so how you do these guys? So it says, what fraction of the offspring will be short in a cross of TT and T little t? So we're going to assume that big T means tall and it's dominant. Okay. Then we have a little t, which we're going to say is short. And we're going to assume it's recessive. Okay. So what we do is we set up is that we're crossing this with that. So we would do big T, little t. Okay. And then you cross, so you pair. So this one with that one would be big T, little t. Yeah, let me use a different color, might look better. Okay, big T, little t. And then, okay. So these right here are your genotypes, your possible genes that you could hold. But they also represent phenotypes, the actual things that the offspring will physically express. So these two right here, two traits, what's the stuff for that? Two traits. Oh, do you mean like if you had to do, say, height and hair color, something like that? Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, I can show you in a second. So when you're doing just a single trait, it looks like this. So just remember though, if you have a big T, you're automatically going to be tall because you have the dominant trait. However, you're also a carrier for being short, even though you're not short yourself. That's a big thing to recognize. Okay. So the only way to be short is you have to, both your alleles have to be short. Okay. So in this case, you would then just count out of the 4. So the number of short to tall, or the number of short out of the total is 2 out of 4, or 1/2. I hope so. Okay. So now to answer Mary's question, if you had multiple traits, so for instance, if you had tall, if you had height, and let's say blonde and brown hair, what you would do is you would split this up. I need more room. Wait 1 second. Let's see a step. Oh, right. Okay. So the way I usually do these is that drawing that whole chart's really long. So I usually do is I kind of do some quote unquote algebra. You then just kind of list out these guys. So you do like a FOIL. So you have this one to this one, this one to this one, this one to this one, and this one to this one. If that makes sense. Hey, Jordan, can you double check me? Is this correct? Not Jordan, John, sorry.
Yeah, it looks correct.
Okay, cool. Just making sure. So that's usually the quickest way I do it. When you have multiple traits, you kind of just FOIL them out. And then you would look at these guys. So here you have tall and blonde, tall and brown, short and blonde, and short and brown. Okay, so moving on. So yeah, no problem. So how many neutrons does the average phosphorus atom have? So this one, let me go back. So it was phosphorus, and it was asking for the number of neutrons. I just need that periodic table. Huh. Okay. I'm not good at PowerPoint, as you can see. Okay. So as we can see, we have phosphorus right here. Okay. And so usually, if you have a normal element, normally, if they don't tell you that's an isotope, you would just assume that it has an equal number of neutrons to protons. So in this case, since it doesn't tell you, go back to the question. So the atomic number for phosphorus is 15, and that's the number of protons and neutrons. So the answer would be A. Yeah, so John just answered that question. Yeah, so if you're doing a question that actually involves the periodic table, you will be given a periodic table. Awesome, cool, cool, cool. Okay, moving on. Okay, so the humoral response fights infection by doing which of the following? Produces antibodies, ingests microbes, forms a barrier of various body fluids, or creates memory cells that remembers a specific infection. Also, one good test taking strategy, if you don't know, you still have a 1 in 4 chance of being right. Okay, so the answer here would be antibodies. It's when B cells produce antibodies against foreign invaders. Okay, so moving on. Okay, so that's right. Yeah, good job, man. So changing sugars is a saccharide. A monosaccharide is a single sugar, while a disaccharide is just 2 sugars bonded together. So changing disaccharide to a monosaccharide involves which of the following processes? Hey, John, can you check the chat? I think Mary has a question.
Yeah, it has to do with humoral response produced memory cells. You want to explain that a bit?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the humoral response does produce memory cells. Matthew, you might be better with this than I am.
It's okay. So I believe what it is that the humoral response produces antibodies, but inside the body you have memory cells. And then the memory cells, after the antibody is produced, they then attach to the foreign pathogen and create like, what's the word? A poster of the foreign invader. But then, so the way I understand it is that memory cells actually help drive a future humoral response, but they aren't produced by the humoral response, I believe.
I think you're correct.
That's the way I understand it.
It's hard to explain.
Yeah, they're like separate cells. Okay, so now going to this question, let's see. So we have, yep, so the answer is hydrolysis. So hydrolysis is basically using water to decompose molecules. A keyword, a key suffix to keep an eye out is lysis. You also see in other things. And in the reverse process, if I was doing monosaccharide to a disaccharide, that'd be a dehydration. You're removing the water to help them bond. Okay, moving on. Okay, so a patient has been diagnosed with a chemical imbalance in his brain. Which part of his neurons is likely to be affected by this imbalance? Okay, so the answer here would be synapses. Right. So synapses are actually where neurotransmitters are released by the neuron to communicate with other neurons. However, if you have a chemical imbalance, that's another way of saying that you maybe aren't releasing the proper amount of neurotransmitters, or maybe you're releasing too much of a certain neurotransmitter. So a chemical imbalance would happen to synapses. Just remember too, the dendrites are where the interaction happens, and axons are actually what carries the signal down the axon, down the neuron. Okay, and lastly, so the cause of advanced kidney disease in a person is most likely which of the following? So the cause of advanced kidney disease in a person, which of the following? B, exactly, right. So advanced kidney disease, able to do it anymore, which means your kidneys are failing. Yeah, and that's pretty much it, guys. 10 minutes to spare. Any more questions, topics, concerns? Any questions about the test itself? John is here, free to answer. Plus, also, guys, I highly recommend you go to our LibGuides. If you go to the tutoring page on John Tyler's main website, this PowerPoint, along with all the materials we use to make it, along with resources like practice tests and TEAS prep book, are all available to you guys. So please make use of that. I will also say too, again, there is a lot of material to cover, but since if you have time before your test, you can totally come into the ARC at any time. You can work with me, John, or any of other STEM tutors, and they'll gladly work through the material with you. Where do you sign up for the TEAS test? Okay. Hey, John, can you answer this one? I think I can find the link.
If she wants to stay around for a minute after, I can answer because I don't know exactly. I think Jen has a better.
Yeah, so we have a friend of ours in another breakout room. She has probably the link on standby. She can just put it in the chat. Give me 1 second. I'm gonna grab her.
Because it's a different process than it used to be. It's going to be remote proctor, and I know that.
Okay. So the math portion is coming up, I believe. I'm not sharing my screen anymore. Let me check my calendar. I don't know if it's next Friday or if it's 2 Fridays from now. Give me 1 second. I believe it's 2 Fridays from now. Or a better way of saying it, 2 weeks from now. And my Wi-Fi is bad, so.
Hey, Matt, can you let Jen know about the remote proctoring question?
Yeah. Let me see. Wait, John, I'm gonna make you co-host. Can you go grab her? I'm still looking up the.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm still grabbing. I'm just looking up the dates for the math thing. Actually, she could probably answer both those questions.
Yeah. She's in room 1, right?
Yeah, she's in room 1 with Noelle.
Okay.
Let's see. Checking my calendar now. Oh, okay. So yeah, the TEAS math workshop is next Friday, the 12th. And it's the same time, 11 a.m., same location. So Sarah, if you want, I'll share my screen. So if we go to the John Tyler homepage, sorry, my Wi-Fi is very slow. Nice. There we go. So you go to John Tyler remote page. It loads. There we go. Okay, so then you go to services, then go to tutoring. Okay, and then if you go down to the bottom, see Math Center LibGuide. And from here you go to test prep and TEAS. And then all our stuff's in here.
And I heard, does somebody have a question about remote proctoring?
Yeah, she was asking where you go to sign up for the TEAS test.
Okay, so it's actually 2 places you have to go. And let me actually, I'll share my screen real quick too, to show you where you need to go. So the first thing you need to do is you need to make an appointment with the testing center. So if you go to services and then testing centers here, and you scroll down a little, there's a whole chunk right in the middle of the page about the TEAS testing. You can schedule your appointment. There's a link here, and they want you to give at least, I think 72 hours is really what they want ahead of time. They test Mondays through Saturdays, and the tests are either at 8:30 a.m. or 1 o'clock p.m. So you fill all this out, and then you're actually going to go to the ATI site. And I'm going to take you where Matt just showed you our LibGuides. I have a document on there. I'm going to show you that real quick because it steps you through. You're going to go onto the ATI site to register also. And that's where you'll pay, and that's where you'll actually click in when you take the test. So go to the LibGuide, and then here's the TEAS. At the bottom, there is a link for this remote proctoring guide. And it kind of tells you like what the technical requirements, and then the web to go to register and all of that stuff. And if you have any questions at all about the remote proctoring, you can always contact the testing center. Their email, I'm going to put it in the chat, is testing@jtcc.edu, or on the testing page, there's actually phone numbers for both campuses so you can talk to somebody. But if you have any questions about any of that, they can help you out. So does that make sense? Yeah, I mean, yeah, you want to make your appointment with the testing center because the John Tyler proctors are the ones who are actually going to be doing the remote proctoring. So I would go ahead and schedule your appointment with them first, and then go on to the ATI site. And you'll have to really ahead of time, you're going to want, there's a browser extension you're going to have. I think it's called Proctorio. So that's the stuff you want to do ahead of time. And then the day of the test, you definitely want to go in like a half hour, 45 minutes before your test starts, because you're going to have to go through a few steps of, you'll connect, and then they'll make sure that your system is right. And then you're going to have to like show them your work area and show them your driver's license and all that kind of stuff. But all that information should be on that PDF that I showed you. And again, like if you have any questions, contact the testing center. They've been doing this remotely since I think April or May last year. So they can walk you through it if you need any speed bumps.
So if I was planning on taking the test towards the end of the month, should I go ahead and sign up now to take it like on the 21st or the?
I think if you're sure you know you want to take it, I think they just want, I think like 3 days heads up just to make sure that they're going to have a proctor available for that time.
Okay, so it's not like there's going to be a waiting list and like too many people are taking it today, so you can't take it.
Right. That's why they want you to do it a few days out. So in case there is, I think the earlier you do it, the better. If you're sure you know exactly what day and what time you want to take it, so that way you can reserve.
Okay.
Because they do have, they have a few proctors working. So I don't think they usually run into too many scheduling issues. But like I said, if you're sure you know what day and time you want to take it, I would go ahead and sign up. If you're not too sure, like if you still are, you do probably have a couple of weeks, but once you're sure, I would go ahead, sign up, get that. And so when you fill out that form, you'll get an email back from the testing center when they confirm your appointment, and it will have a some kind of, I forget the word, but it's some kind of number that you're going to need when you go register. When you go to take the test, you'll have to put it in on the ATI site to let them know like your stuff. So you do the John Tyler thing and then the ATI, get your computer all set up, and then the day of the test, just log into the ATI site a little early to get everything going.
All right, and do the bar graph that we need in order to apply to nursing school, that's gonna pop up at the end of the test and we can download it?
I
Yes, it
believe
will.
so. I'm not sure. John, how does that?
You'll get your results immediately after you like take a survey at the end of the test.
Yep.
Okay,
So, yeah.
all right, great.
So you'll know your score before you walk out of the test.
Okay,
Or, yeah, before you walk out.
Yeah, I'm assuming they must, since they can't hand you a piece of paper, I'm assuming they must give you, they must give it to you in like a PDF or.
Well, it'll be displayed on the screen when they submit.
Ah, gotcha. There you go. So you'll have it.
thank you.
No worries.
welcome.
If you think of any more questions, please, I'm sure John kind of told you, come in, you can talk to him. If you have any procedural questions, you can let us or the testing center know, and we'll do our best to help you get all set up.
All right.
And individually, we can just pop in anytime to get help with like the math portion.
Oh yeah, for sure. Anytime we have drop-in hours, Monday through Thursday, 10 to 6, come on in, you can work with a tutor. You can always, if those times aren't great for you, you can use our after hours request form, and you can request an appointment like in the evenings or on the weekends, and we can set something up for you that way too.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Any more questions? All right, cool. So that's all, guys. If you want to head out, feel free to go.
Yep. Thanks for coming.
Yeah,
We
thanks
do
for
have the
stopping
math-
by.
Yeah, we have the math workshop next week, and then the English language the Friday after that. So see you there too.
And there we go.